Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome. Well, it's morning for me. I shouldn't make assumptions. It's not going to be morning for all of you, is it? So, anyway, welcome. See a couple of new people that I haven't seen before. And yeah, we have some interesting questions this morning. Hi, Ricardo. So, and Kim. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm sure we'll have a few other people join us as we go along, but let's go ahead and get started. We have a lot of interesting topics to talk about here. So, Kim, I think I'll start with your questions. You say, I asked last time about the agitation between my eyes, and it has not been very bothersome since because I've started to just accept it. That's great. But I've noticed that when I get very stable attention, exclusive attention, and feel relaxed and pleasant, I notice flashes and vibrating light occurring behind my eyelids. This very much sounds like some of the descriptions of pacification of the senses. I absolutely agree with you. That's exactly what it sounds like. But you go on to say, however, I'm a bit worried about the fact that when I get up from the sit, my vision is a bit blurry, different for an hour or so after this. Is this normal? Okay, well, if by normal, does this happen to most people? No, it doesn't, at least in terms of visual effects. But if we look at the auditory aspect of pacification of the senses, when that internal sound begins to be generated, it is very common, it is normal for that to persist beyond the time that a person is sitting. Also, sometimes the bodily sensations associated with pacification of the senses also continue. Now, for me, it seems very reasonable to extrapolate that, well, if these other manifestations of pacification can occur, like with the inner sound, that can just, for some people, that becomes an almost permanent part of their auditory experience, at least for a while. So why shouldn't this or something similar to this happen with regard to the visual effects? So I would definitely normalize this. It doesn't sound to me like anything terribly unusual. Okay, so you've been saying, I've been trying to incorporate this into my mindful review as a way of not getting caught up in worrying, ruminating about it. But I can't help but worry whether this could be something harmful to my vision. Well, that's a very good way to approach it. But the other thing is, when the mind is tending to worry about something and ruminating about it, if there is a way to eliminate the source of that worry, then you should do that. Well, of course, asking me this question is a part of that. But first of all, I can say with total confidence, nothing that is happening in your meditation is going to be harmful to your vision. I can say that without the slightest hesitation. On the other hand, there are certain problems that can develop, particularly with the retina of the eye. You know, it can become partially detached, folds can develop, things like that. And one of the effects that produces is flashes of light in the periphery of your visual field. Now, meditation won't cause that, and meditation won't make that any worse. But part of relieving the worry in your mind would be to say, well, maybe this is a coincidence, and this just happened to arise at the same time and be more noticeable after my meditations. It wouldn't be surprising that something like this would be more noticeable after your meditations, especially if you're getting visual effects during the meditation. But just in case there is some problem with your eye that's developing, coincidentally appearing as a part of your meditation, it wouldn't hurt to get to see an ophthalmologist and say, I keep seeing light flashes, in the periphery of my vision. He or she will do an appropriate examination of your retina. If there's a problem, find a way to treat it. And if there's not, reassure you. And that's going to go a long way from keeping any kind of worrying and ruminating from occurring. Okay? Great. You had another question. How should I relate to dullness occurring in daily life? More specifically, dullness setting in between 1 and 4 p.m. due to the circadian rhythm. I have a lot of online lectures due to COVID-19, and the dullness makes it very hard to concentrate during this period of the day. Should I use the same antidotes as described in the book? I can't help but feel a lot of aversion towards the dullness. I know exactly what you mean about the dullness when you're trying to do something. Recently, I've been, I have certain health problems that I know would account for it, but when I'm trying to work or write, I'll find myself getting sleepy. And because of the intention, the purpose of what I'm trying to do, the importance of it to me, it's very easy to have an aversion to this. Like, I need to do this thing. I can't be falling asleep. So approach that mindfully. And I'm sure you won't have any problem understanding what I mean by that. Do you? Is that pretty straightforward? You examine it from a point of view of acceptance, but also, is there anything you can do about it? Well, you have already accurately identified it as being related to, this is a low point, and this is true of the majority of people. This period of 1 to 4 p.m., your metabolism goes into a very low point, and it's more difficult to maintain a high level of alertness at this time of day. So what are some practical things that you can do about that? I don't know about you, but a lot of people would have they'd just be in the process of digesting their midday meal when this happens. You could try changing the time that you eat so that you either eat earlier or you eat later, or maybe you even skip midday meal or just have a light snack. That way you don't have two things contributing to that sleepiness when you're trying to listen to your lectures. Okay. As far as applying the techniques that are described in stage 4 for dealing with this kind of progressive dullness, go ahead and try them and use them. They will help to some degree. The cause of the drowsiness is different. And so it's not going to work in quite the same way that you might have experienced it in meditation, but it's still going to be helpful. Okay, it's still worth doing. And just as you can train your mind out of dullness in meditation, you can at least train your mind to be more resistant to dullness or to be more quickly responsive to it. Now that's really that's the crux of what you do in meditation, is learn as quickly as possible to recognize at the earliest point possible the onset of dullness so that you can intervene. The same thing is going to apply in terms of that drowsiness, because the longer it goes on, the stronger it is, the harder it is you pull yourself out of it. So doing those practices and interrupting the progress of dullness as quickly as you can is going to reduce it's going to make it easier to contend with the dullness. as far as the aversion to it, let that go. This is just what's happening. You know why it's happening. So don't let that don't let that contribute anymore to that. Okay. Excuse me, I'm going to mute myself and cough for a minute. Anyway, thank you. So, Kim, were these helpful answers to you?
Yes, definitely. I think the dullness thing, that it's really, because of the meditation, it's become very quickly recognized. But yeah, the only problem is that I expect myself to not be tired, and that's what creates the aversion and makes it worse.
Yes, which is, yeah, it is going to make it worse. So just recognizing that, try to let that go. Try to just, don't feed it, don't reinforce it. Just, of course, I feel aversion to falling asleep in the middle of an important class.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Let's see. Next, we have a question from Gunnar. And the Gunnar's here. That's good.
Hey, Travis.
So Gunnar says, I've had a practice gap. Coming back, I was able to resume roughly from where I had left it off. Perhaps due to some crystallized insight, ? Anyway, I have confidence that time and patience will bring about more insight to degrees that I can't even conceive. Yeah, let me respond to that. It's not especially what you're asking, but something that's I think very worthwhile to say a little bit about. You say you've noticed that even after a gap in your practice, that you pretty easily come back to where you had left off rather than having to go back and work your way through a long process. And what I thought was really interesting about that was that you attributed that to, as you, in your words, some crystallized insight. And I thought I would take this as an opportunity to help everyone have a little better understanding, even an experiential understanding of what insight is. Now, we can understand things at an intellectual level. And let's use an example. In your meditation, you can understand that you are not in control of your mind, and you can relax all of the stress, and you can let go of the stress and trying to make things happen, and the striving, which is just going to make your meditation less stable and more difficult, right? But that's something that keeps recurring, and it keeps being reinforced. What happens is you find yourself resisting the fact that your attention wants to move, and you keep trying to take control of it. Or no matter what it is, what kind of practice you're doing, your intention is for the practice to go this way, and then it doesn't. And so you start feeling frustrated and start striving and things like that. And then you realize that, oh yeah, and then that enables you to start letting go of that. Now, this is just understanding. And there's all kinds of understandings. You can intellectually understand emptiness and no self and the truth of suffering and everything else. That doesn't mean it's going to be part of what's taking place in perception and processing and response in the moment. It's a piece of information that you have back here that you have to access separately in order for it to serve any purpose. Insight is where an understanding becomes incorporated into the way you perceive continuously, and so you don't have to call up this understanding or this knowledge. You don't have to spend a period of time where you're not perceiving that way until you remember that you've learned that there is a different way to see things. That's what insight is. And so in what I talked about a few minutes ago, realizing that there's no I in controlling your mind, that's a sort of a partial insight into no self. And at some point, instead of being a fact that you can call up and make use of, it's always there, or at least in meditation, it's always there. When you're meditating, you always know that you can't do this. Those kinds of problems just never arise anymore, right? So this is just one example. All of the things that you've learned in your meditation up to this point have, to the degree that they've become insight knowledge instead of just information, they now are a part of how you interpret and respond to your experience. So yeah, you take a break in meditation, and these things have already become a part of the way you perceive your inner reality. So of course they're going to be there. This is, people do experience that they fall away from meditation and then they have to go back, but very quickly they kind of catch up to where they were before. Other people will have the experience of, wow, I stopped and almost picked up right away from, and you very correctly identified that. But the reason I wanted to talk about it was to help everybody get a little more understanding, a little bit more clarity of what is insight knowledge, what is insight understanding. So you can understand the hell out of emptiness and give 2-hour lectures to a sophisticated audience on the subject. But when you're walking around in your daily life and the understanding of emptiness is not a part of your daily experience, that's not insight. When the fundamental assumptions by which your mind constructs its interpretation of experience as arises has dropped the idea of things being existentially real, but rather being empty projections of your mind and attempt to interpret reality, when that becomes a fundamental assumption that determines how you interpret the information that comes in through your eyes when you open them, how you interpret the information that comes in through your ears and your other senses. If you start seeing things from the point of view of emptiness, that is insight. And it's totally different than understanding it theoretically well enough to give lectures on it and debate other scholars on it and everything else, right? So I just wanted to take advantage of your wording there to give a little brief mini lecture on the difference between intellectual understanding or ordinary understanding and insight, and what we're all about here. Anyway, I have confidence that time and patience will bring about more insight to degrees I can't even conceive. Absolutely, because you've had enough of experience of that already to know that this is very likely to be true. Yet my mind asked me, why should I prefer a meditative state of mind over any other state? That's a wonderful question. That you've arrived at the point of asking that question is a wonderful thing. Because part of the sort of vague misunderstanding of what this whole insight awakening meditation project is all about tends to be, for many, if not most people, it tends to be this idea that, and it's based on your past life experience. I'm going to go into a state that's better than the states I'm normally in. But we're not talking in this Insight and Awakening Project about finding a more comfortable state. You can do that with opiates. There's all kinds of other drugs that you can do that with. There are all kinds of systems of training so that you can train yourself to enter into different states that are more pleasant or more comfortable or more useful in one way or another. And of course, people do bring, this is what their familiar experience is, you know, I'm in an unhappy state, let me do something that's put me in a happy state, right? So there is an expectation that, oh, well, these results I want from meditation are going to be context-dependent states. And some really nice states do occur in meditation. But actually, I talk about that bit in the introduction to the Mind Illuminated. These are some really nice states, but they're not what this is all about, right? So that's a good question, very good question to ask and to recognize the answer to through asking the question, and then just with that question as a basis, observing your mind as it goes into different meditative states. And what you'll see, what will become really obvious, is it's not about a meditative state or even a particular state, because a well-functioning human mind is constantly moving from one state to another. But it's a more global orientation to the kinds of states. And in a more fundamental sense, it's letting go of mental states that are based on a diluted misunderstanding of the nature of reality and your relationship to it, and replacing that, you know, with wisdom, with insight. And so it ultimately comes down to, well, it's not about states. Fluctuating states are always going to be part of mind. It's more this global perceptual shift and understanding that regardless of what's happening around you, that the way that the mind as a system is going to respond to that is going to be in a more stable and wholesome way and maintain a much deeper sense of well-being. So that's a good question to ask. And then you ask another one, what is wrong about suffering? And this is another thing, I'm not talking about you, but I'm talking about people in general. Will often come to meditation that I'm going to get rid of all suffering. By extension, they'll sometimes say, I expect to be free from all emotions because so much of my suffering is due to my emotions and things like that. And it's quite understandable why people would come to that. But what we're really after is a much deeper understanding of suffering, its nature and its causes. And suffering, of course, there's different kinds of suffering, and there's different kinds, and there's different causes for that. There's nothing wrong with suffering per se. Pain, without pain, you would be in trouble. There are people and animals who are born with an inherited condition where they don't feel pain, and they don't survive very long. And for the time that they do survive, all of the different parts of their body, the joints in their hands, you know, are sustaining so much damage because they don't experience pain. Pain is useful. Pain is good. Pain is valuable. But then on the other hand, we have people that, you know, they create all this unnecessary internal pain. They fabricate all these stories. They put themselves in deep despair and despondency and depression. They become violent or angry as a way of dealing with their pain instead of going to the root of it. You know, there's all this pain and misery that is different from that. And that's what we're after, is to understand, you know, basically the first and second noble truths. Understand the nature of pain and understand the causes of pain And the third noble truth is understanding what it is that you can do about it. Physical pain is always going to be there. But there's most of the pain that human beings experience, most of the suffering that they experience is generated within their own minds. It has nothing to do with pain sense organs. And as a matter of fact, even when the average person does experience a physical pain, they amplify it enormously through their mind's reaction to it. So, when it comes to the question, what is wrong about suffering? What is wrong about it is that it's a good thing when it serves its intended purpose and it doesn't explode and get out of control. But when it does, it creates all kinds of totally unnecessary misery. And the tendency is to spread that around. Like Eckhart Tolle says that once your pain body is activated, it wants to activate everybody else's pain body. Isn't that true? Isn't that true? The more pain that we feel, the more we want to make sure everybody else feels it too. Yeah. When you're feeling miserable, you can't stand to smile on somebody else's face. But these are good questions. It's wonderful that you're at a point of asking these questions. Just what I would say is don't try to figure out the answer. Don't try to use logic and analysis and deconstruction and all this sort of stuff. Just observe. Open yourself up to, yeah, this is a nice meditative state. You can compare it, you can do the same thing when other states arise in different situations. And in all of them, you just hold this question is, why should I prefer one state of mind over another state of mind? Let it answer you. Don't figure it out. Let it tell you the answer. What is wrong with suffering? When you're feeling suffering, when you're not feeling suffering, when you've been suffering and it goes away, and when you haven't been suffering and it comes on. Just examine all of these things and find for yourself what is the answer about what's wrong with suffering and what's, and yeah. Is that helpful to you in that regard?
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. One way I've been thinking about it is that I basically and it touches on what you said about not looking the analytical answer to something, but just thinking in terms, I don't need to justify my meditating. I can just do it just because, not even because I want to, but just because I do, right? So yeah, no, that helps. As always, very helpful.
Yeah, great. Yeah, just back to that other point. If you think about it and analyze it, you'll come up with some nice little answer that you can store on the shelf with all of your other intellectual understandings. It's not going to do you much good in the long run.
Yeah, I reckon this is just a little bit of confusion, perhaps, with my picking up of the practice again. Some things are coming to light, and it's just some confusion that I'm communicating here in a way. But I thought it would be, very helpful to get your feedback on it, and it was indeed. So, yeah, it's good.
Yeah, that's great, and I'm really glad that you did that. Did you ask those questions? One of the things that I mentioned, I never want to say anything that might reinforce anyone's tendency to let their practice slide. But when, for whatever reason, your practice is interrupted and you come back to it, there's something about that fresh start that you often you just often have a clearer perception of certain things that maybe it's kind of like something that's always there and you notice it, but then you stop noticing it and it's just there. You come back to that same situation and all of a sudden you see it like you never saw it before. So I don't want to encourage people to take breaks from their practice, but that is something that certainly does happen. Even in your meditation, you get into perceptual habits, patterns that obscure something in a way that you just never look at it.
Definitely, it kind of becomes routine, right? Just sit down and it's just business as usual.
That's right. Business as usual. So you don't question it. You don't see what else there is to it.
Yeah.
There's one part of what you said. Well, go ahead. Did you want to say something else?
No.
You continue with a side question, but it's one that I really liked a lot. Is thought an a posteriori rationalization of a process which has already taken place? And is that why thoughts don't matter? Is the sole purpose of thought that of human communication? Well, can we just dialogue a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure.
The idea that thoughts don't matter.
Mhm.
Tell me about why you would say thoughts, why you would think thoughts don't matter.
Well, it's something you said at one point, and I've been trying to understand it better. You mentioned something about, I don't remember the specifics of the situation and the context that we were analyzing, but it was something about it's just a thought, right? It's just a thought. And when you're sitting down in meditation, you know you're safe and sound. You're at home, somewhere safe. You can let thoughts come and go, and they don't really matter in that sense. It's just a thought. I guess at that time the thought was I wasn't aware in the past moment. You know, I've lost awareness for a moment. I think we were discussing that
Yeah.
Situation, perception, and then I was trying. I don't think if there is a deeper understanding of what thought is in that, and I was trying to perceive that in my day to day, and and in my actions, you know how, and I, you know, I guess I could catch a glimpse of me thinking without words necessarily, just acting in the world, right? And I was wondering if that's thought. Is there a still underlying process which is happening, and I'm just perceiving the thought, and so I guess a different way to put it is, can my, I don't want to say ego, but can thought change that underlying process, or is that always just an image, just a consequence?
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. Let's look at this. What you're really talking about is thoughts that take a verbal form, that are in language. Now, not everybody thinks in words. Some people think in imagery, and other people think, you know, in sort of a kinesthetic experience. But in all these cases, it's symbolic. Now, there's a huge value in putting something into the form of symbols that you can manipulate independently. And that's a tremendous value that language has. Language probably developed initially as sounds that began to have a meaning that was independent of the sound itself. I mean, there's a cry of fear or a sound of anger or something like that, which isn't really symbolic. It's just what the sound is that an organism makes when it's in those states. But at some point it begins to take on, it becomes a symbol. And even before there's speech, there's primates that make particular sounds and they symbolize something. That's the beginning of language. As this becomes further refined and developed, what we have is language as a way of symbolizing concepts. So we've got the symbol for a complex concept. And once we get used to that symbol, boy, can we ever process information really fast using symbols. As a matter of fact, isn't this exactly what mathematics did? They learn to put things in the form of symbols. The more well-defined those symbols are, the easier it is to manipulate them, and there's just so much we can do with them, and you can do it so much more quickly. And the same thing is true of language, of internal language. Once we have language, we can use it, and we will use it internally. And we can think about things just in the same way we can put information into a mathematical formula, and we can manipulate it far more effectively and come up with answers that we might stumble towards forever without actually finding. Same thing, there's a hugely important role that thought plays, that verbal thought plays, or symbolic thought. Doesn't have to be verbal, as I said, but symbolic thought, once it's developed, it's an extremely powerful tool. Where thought becomes problematic is this particular tool is so powerful, and we use it all the time, not just externally, but internally. The mechanism of mind that does this, just it gets used to running all the time, churning every bit of information that there is there. And, you know, at some point, it's not going anywhere. It's not doing anything useful. It's not even being assembled in an appropriate kind of syntax to be productive. We end up with all these stories we tell ourselves that make us miserable and make it difficult for us to deal with other people and other situations. So it's not a control thought that is the problem, and thoughts are just the thoughts. When you are using symbolic thought intentionally to try to understand something, that's a really good kind of thought. When the thinking part of your mind is just spewing out thoughts, those are just thoughts. They're not part of a systematic endeavor. And if anything, at the very least, they're a waste of time. But at the worst, they're harmful and they're dangerous. So what we really want to do, and I'm not talking to you in this because I think you already know and understand this, but so many people have somehow gotten the idea that the purpose of meditation is to stop thought. And we don't want to do that. We want to stop the useless elaboration and confabulation of thought that takes place and that actually creates so many of our problems. We want to bring that thinking mechanism into under intentional control so that it does all the wonderful things it can do, but it doesn't create all these problems by running in the background with no direction all of the time. Now, in terms of, there is one of the practices in stage 7 that I really strongly recommend that people do is the exploration of non-symbolic versus symbolic thought. Now, I'm going to go back to the wording in your question. You said, is thought an a posteriori rationalization of a process which has already taken place? What it is an a posteriori symbolic systemization of a process which has already taken place. So this is what non-symbolic thought is. It hasn't been converted into symbols. Now, there is a problem with symbolic thought. For all of its enormous power, when you condense something into a symbol, and that symbol has all this predefined, not just meaning, but innuendo and everything else, that comes as part of the package. This is something that prior to becoming symbolic, thoughts are much more fluid. They can shift and change and interact and flow in a way that once they become words and symbols, then those thoughts, there's a certain rigidity, the structure of the words and the syntax of the sentence is now driving the thought in a particular direction that may not be where you really want and need it to go. And so Yeah, explore that practice of symbolic versus non-symbolic thought. There's so much about your mind.
So when we're talking about non-symbolic, obviously the sensation of the breath on the nose, which we acquire over a bit of time meditating, that's also non-symbolic, right? We try to get at a pure physical sensation, right?
Yeah.
But if I got it right, there is also, but that's not really thought, right? That's a sensation.
Yes,
As opposed
it's just sensation, but the thing is we elaborate those sensations into concepts, and then those concepts eventually take on a symbolic form. And somebody just beginning to meditate is really watching a flow of symbols.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
So we can experience non-symbolic thought.
Yes,
Mhm.
we can. And we can come to appreciate it. And out of that understanding and appreciating of it will just naturally come the tendency to be a little more on guard against the kinds of traps that symbolic thought can take you into, right? And also a recognition of the creative freedom of thought that is possible when you don't let it become too symbolic and overly conceptual too quickly, or the ability to retreat from that symbolic structure back to just the raw process of creating a synthesis of an attempted model of reality. And you can discover all kinds of new relationships that are not available once it's been converted into symbols.
Does that speak to us trying to not die? Basically, is that? I think you mentioned at one point that we have this tool that we keep using because it has kept us safe so far, and we have this tendency to keep using this, which I think would be analytical thought. And then you mentioned something in the lines of, well, we've come to a place where we don't need it as much anymore, right? If I understood it correctly. Is that because it's become like a part of us, like an automatic reaction to keep living, or why wouldn't we need it anymore?
Yes, that automatic part of us that wants to keep us living, it's really deeply embedded. You couldn't get rid of it, or if you did get rid of it, well, as a matter of fact, I think a lot of times what people die from is just that just kind of winds down, right? But and the pain of living just doesn't become worth it. But
So that's what I don't mean to interrupt, but that's what we, in a way, when we talk about letting go, that's the thing we would rely on. You can let go because there is an underlying fundamental mechanism that is going to keep you well.
yeah,
Is that one way to put it?
that's right. And you let it alert you to when you need to employ your higher faculties to keep this happening. And you appreciate it when it does that, but you just don't make it into this real thing that you used to make it into. You know it for what it is. It's this part of me that's looking after the maintenance of the integrity of the body, of the personhood, of taking care of the well-being of the body and the mind in terms of those things that belong to me and those things that don't. But now it happens in a much more healthy way, because it's not based on the delusion of something that's real and ill-defined compulsions that are fine for a mindless state. But when you've got a mind and when you can examine things and put things in perspective, you don't want to be driven by those mindless compulsions. They're good for dogs, they're good for deer, they're good for mountain lions, but they're not good for us.
Yeah, that's good. Well, this is great. Very insightful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, Ahmet, how are you today?
I'm good. Thank you.
All right. Good to see you. how can we be sure that the things we've discovered about our mind apply to the other humans? Is there another way to validate them other than external verification through observable behavior of others? That is an interesting question. First of all, I think you're probably familiar with what's known as theory of mind, that we come to, this happens as a part of our early development, is we come to attribute consciousness and mind to other beings because of the way that they behave. And so all of us develop this theory of mind that other beings have minds, and some kinds of beings don't. Rocks and tables don't have minds, but dogs and cats and people, moms and dads and brothers and sisters, they have minds. And not only that, we begin to interpret what's going on in their minds. You know, oh, what you really feel about me is such and such, because we look at what's manifesting and then we interpret it in terms of how we would process something and why we would behave that way, right? So we end up not only have a theory that other people have minds like ours, we try to read their minds by extrapolating our own thoughts and reactions and behaviors to other people. This can be really good, but it also creates a lot of problems, doesn't it? It really helps us in our communication with other people. Facial expressions, body language, all of these other things. Part of that communication is this theory of mind that when somebody's eyebrow goes up or the corners of their mouth turn down or something like that, you know, I know what's going on inside that other person's mind. And when it's right, it's good. And when it's wrong, it creates problems. But yeah, that's theory of mind. And we do go by appearances. We go by what we can see, hear, probably at some subconscious level, what we can smell in terms of pheromones that are being released and things like that. So this is the way that we come about understanding other humans. As we begin to have a deeper understanding of our own minds, as insight begins to develop, then we can use that knowledge to interpret other people in a much more accurate way. When we don't understand ourselves, then we project the same mistakes about how our mind works onto how other people's minds work. The more clearly we understand how our own minds work and our relationship to the world and to other people, then we open ourselves up to a much deeper understanding of the behaviors and the motivations behind those behaviors and the thoughts and feelings that are going on in other minds. But we're still essentially in the place of we're depending upon external verification through observable behaviors, right? And what you're asking is there another way? Well, I would say yes, but you have to keep in mind that this is only my mind's way of modeling something that's going on. But everyone does, to a greater or lesser degree, experience, at least in certain relationships, and maybe in more, maybe it becomes more general, but this more immediate intuitive sense of what somebody else is thinking or feeling, or what their experience is about, and what might be driving their speech and behavior. Okay? I mean, isn't that something we've all experienced, in at least in some relationships, at least to some degree? And nobody has to assume that what I'm going to say now is some kind of universal truth. But for me, this fits really well into everything else that I have learned about minds and about people and about both the physical world and the mental world. And that is that just as absolutely everything in the physical realm is densely and inextricably interconnected with absolutely everything else in the physical realm, the same is true in the mental realm. So there is a deep level in which there is, let's call it a mind-to-mind communication that is not dependent upon visual cues and auditory cues, fleeting facial expressions, body language, and things like that. It's not dependent upon external verification through the senses. I experience this as a reality, and it helps me enormously. Makes more sense of everything. It allows me to be more successful in my interactions with other people. So maybe my description, my conceptual formation of why that is, that there is some kind of more direct connection, maybe that's not accurate. I don't care. It seems obvious to me and it works for me. And I'll be happy to question it as soon as something comes up that doesn't work for me in that regard. And I do, and that does happen, and I do. I do question it. I do try to understand, this just doesn't fit with my inner theory of how things are. And so I examine that, and maybe I'll change my inner theory or whatever. So I do believe there is something else.
I think there might be a physical basis for your theory. Like I read something about mirror neurons.
Yes.
Like I think it sounds similar to your theory. Like we are experiencing what the other person is feeling.
Well, that's the part that I think is sufficiently well validated that yes, there are mirror neurons, but the activation of those mirror neurons require that some sense organ detects something about the other physical body and its behavior. I'm talking about something that's a little more subtle than that. The sense organs thing, I think we could take that as a fact, that the sense organs and the mirror neurons, when at a barely conscious level or even an unconscious level, we're reading the body language and facial expressions of someone else, then what's happening is that sensory information is triggering mirror neurons, and the mirror neurons create an internal model of what we think this other person is experiencing. But that's still based on external verification, right? Yeah, we're basing on information that has to come through the physical sense organs. And you don't have to agree with me. I'm just saying that I feel like there's actually something a little more subtle there. I think that it's absolutely necessary that our minds isolate. Each mind isolates itself to a sufficient degree from other minds around it, because that's a very important part of being able to survive and doing what you need to do. But I think that maybe that distinction, that separation between you and me is not as great as it seems to be.
So like you are talking about feeling what other person feels, but like it doesn't fit your model of mind. Like it's something, how can I say, unfamiliar.
Yes. Well, what it comes from is as what I describe as a non-duality of mind and matter. That mind is not one thing and matter is something else. And mind is not something that matter generates when it gets complicated enough. And matter is not something that the mind generates to explain its experience. But rather, what we see as matter from the outside and we experience as mind from the inside is actually the same stuff. It is neither matter nor mind. It only appears as matter when we look at it from the outside. It only appears as mind when we look at it from the inside. It's all the same stuff. So just as when we look at everything material from the outside, we can see that there's this dense interconnectedness, that nothing is independent from anything else. Well, why should it be if matter and mind are the same stuff? And why shouldn't exactly that same description apply to mind? That everything that is of the nature of mind, whether it seems to be occurring in your mind or Pasquale's or my mind or something like that, why would it be any less interconnected than everything that we see in the material world if matter and mind are really just two ways of seeing the same stuff? It would seem to be that that's the nature of that stuff. And that's how I see that, yes, that there is this connection. So we can, we can base it on physical sense organs and what we can see, hear, smell, taste, whatever. But there is this other interconnectedness there. Well, that's just my ideas. That works for me. But I feel pretty confident it's an accurate description. It may be an incomplete description, but I think there really is something there.
I mean, this idea of interconnectedness seems vague to me. Like like you say, the physical things are interconnected, but like in which way? Like in space, or like I don't know. I can find a basis for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's more to your question here. I think let's go on and look at that. Is the knowledge gained through insight, both mundane and supramundane, experimental and contain an induction element? That is, assuming that one thing discovered about a particular experience applies to the other similar experience as well. For example, suffering. Well, when you say is the knowledge gained through insight, both mundane and supramundane, experimental, what I would do is I'd say, let's use the word experiential. Okay. And then can we refine that experiential knowledge in such a way that through that first of all, there's going to be this tendency by induction to assume that, this thing that I've seen in this case must apply to all of these similar cases. Now, where it becomes experimental, it's not experimental when we just start with, well, if this is true in this case, it must be true in every case. That's just the beginning, and there's nothing experimental about that. It becomes experimental when you say, okay, there's this hypothesis that this what was true in this case will be true in that case, and so I'll examine that case, and then another case, and another, and this is where knowledge grows, and insight knowledge is just like intellectual knowledge in the way that this process takes place, is that you keep trying this theory of what explains this phenomena will explain that phenomena, and you accumulate the times that it's verified, the hypothesis is verified, and there's other times where the hypothesis is not verified. Well, if you disregard the cases where it's not verified, then growth in knowledge and understanding stop cold. But if you say, oh, wow, there's something more to be learned here in these events where the hypothesis doesn't seem to be verified, what's different about this? Then you grow more and more in understanding. This is true of both intellectual knowledge. I mean, you can see, I think it should be obvious to all of you how this is an important part of how we learn, how we've learned basically since the day that we left the womb, is formulating hypotheses about how things work and then testing them over and over again and coming up with this understanding. Insight understanding is where this gets incorporated into how you see the world, right? We can say that most human beings live in a state of delusion because they have formulated hypotheses about themselves and the reality that they're interacting with and a part of that are false, that for one reason or another, they've never pushed them further. So their worldview at the level of insight understanding is flawed, and it incorporates a lot of error. That's the whole thing about refining our mental abilities through meditation. When we can control the focus and the scope of attention, when we can apply this in a penetrating way, the vipassana function, when we can expand awareness to interact very effectively with attention, what we're doing is we're testing all of our different, we're able to test these fundamental hypotheses that we've taken for granted because everybody else in our society takes them for granted. And insight is where you begin to discover that, oh, this was a false premise, and this works much better. And so you throw out the old false premise and you bring in the new premise. Well, of course, as time goes by, your new premise may turn out to be flawed as well and need to be replaced by a better one. And so, of course, you have stages of awakening, right? You have stream entrance versus arhats. But what is happening in this process is that the fundamental worldview, the assumptions by which you interpret the sensory data coming in, and include the mind sense in this, but even how you interpret your own internal processes, that is undergoing this continuous process of modification and refinement. And you're coming up with a much more workable and solid foundation for how you expect things to work in the world. And so really, experiential is absolutely necessary because otherwise it's just a string of thoughts and words. But beyond experiential, doesn't matter whether it's a string of thoughts and words or it's based on experience. It has to be experimental. You can't just say, oh, this is the way it is. I am a separate self, and the only way I'm going to be happy is to manipulate everything and everything around me, because you're going to end up feeling miserable and wondering why. Why doesn't that work? Why in this damn casino of life can I never win? But if you learn to use these mental faculties and take a much more experimental and open-minded approach to your fundamental assumptions, then that allows you to let go of the idea that I am a separate self. That allows you to let go of the idea that my happiness or my suffering depends on what those other things and those other beings out there do to me. And then everything starts to work much, much better. So you could look at it in this way, that the Awakening Project is going back to a process of learning, revising our worldview, improving our worldview, making it more consistent, finding out why what you have induced should be true of this situation, just like it was in that, isn't true. What is the difference? So does that make sense? You like
Yes.
that idea?
Yeah, so like in a way we can say that the awakening is finding a theory that explains everything very well.
Yeah, you just keep on improving your model of reality and making it work better and better and better. Yeah. So Is there anything more to this question of yours that we should address?
No.
Oh, this last thing, if so, how can these knowledges satisfy the mind without being an a priori a knowledge that is known independent from experience? Well, yes, let me just explain that, because I think there's a lot of potential for increased understanding if we look at that. A priori, in the sense that you come into the world, and this is the basis, these are the set of fundamental assumptions that you're going to process information on. But you come into the world over and over and over again, second by second, day by day, hour by hour, event by event. So what a priori applies to what you bring with you into this circumstance in this moment. So you can acquire a new understanding, and then that becomes the a priori assumption that is going to guide your interpretation of what happens in future moments. Does that kind of resolve that apparent conflict? Yes, it is a priori once it has been experientially validated to some degree, so that it becomes incorporated into the fundamental set of assumptions that you interpret your experience on. It was not a priori in the moment before that happened, but it will be a priori subsequently, and at least until that time comes that you replace some other assumptions with some that seem to be better. Then that will become the a priori knowledge. Okay. So we just jump from a sort of static view to a process view, to a kind of a developing systems view of the mind and of understanding. All of a sudden, a priori, a posteriori. Well, it depends. Are you talking about now or then, or? So, in terms of your wording of the sentence, just to help make sure I'm clear here. A knowledge that is known independent from experience, that's what you bring to the experience. Okay. And where did you get that from? You got that from a previous experience where it was not a priori present. Am I getting too technical and intellectual and boring you to death? Okay. Anything anyone want to say or comments? Or?
Reason I asked this was like, in philosophy, usually the experimental or experiential knowledge is like questionable. Like there are many philosophers who preferred creation, like the mind's knowledge, like the philosophers of creationism. So like I expected this higher or mundane insights, like a priori, in a sense that they can be like the reality can not be conceivable without them. Like it can't be in another way. Like it's the only way.
I apologize that I had trouble understanding what you were saying, and I thought I'd mention it because it may be that other people had trouble understanding that too. Could you say it again, and or at least say the most important part of it again? Try to enunciate as clearly as you can.
I said like the reason I asked this was I expected this supramundane insights to be something that's like always true, and the reality without them is inconceivable. Like there cannot be another way.
Yeah.
Like 2 + 2 is 4. Like there cannot be another way. Are they like are they truths in this sense, or like they are just fit for our past experiences? Like they are just suitable for our past experiences, but they are not necessary. Our future experiences are not necessary to be in this way necessarily. Yeah.
But yes. I think what you're kind of raising is, is there some absolute truth that that exists independently of experiences and of the mind learning to understand that truth? And this, now, I'm very comfortable with the idea that there is an ultimate reality that is the way it is. But I also realize I am never going to fully grasp and understand that. So in that sense that there is some reality outside of my own projections, my own mind, my own attempt to model that reality, yes, there is an absolute truth that exists independently of my experience and my thoughts, my meditations, and everything else. But all I can ever know, no matter what, is the model, the representation, the attempt to create a mental facsimile of that greater reality, of that truth. Okay? So there is this, from this point of view, my life is a journey, my experiences and what I do with them. My experiences aren't nearly so important as what I do with them. But all of these things are helping me to create a crude stick model in my mind of a reality that I will never know. And that reality, that is that sort of ultimate truth. It is there. And to the degree that I continue to pursue that and test the validity of my stick model in my mind against experience, I will come closer to that incrementally. Okay? And it serves that same purpose as there being some absolute truth that is independent of my experience. But nevertheless, what I know can only be the product of my experience and what I do with that experience. Okay? So I have all the advantages of some ultimate truth. Maybe this is part of what a priori, the meaning by a priori. But I have all the advantages of that there is something that I can measure my internal models against. But that's what the process of life and awakening and gaining greater wisdom is all about. It's that approach to that. So, yeah, back to what I was saying before. This, to the degree that my a priori assumptions in this moment are closer to whatever that ultimate truth is than they were yesterday, then now I have this much access to that ultimate truth that I can bring to my experience today and tomorrow. Did I get at what you were trying
Yes.
to?
Yes. Thank you.
Anything else anyone would like to comment on with regard to that? Well, then let's look at your question, Adam. Welcome. I don't recognize or remember you. Is this the first time you've joined us to one of these Q&As?
Yes, I asked you a question, I think a year or two ago, which you answered. I was living overseas at the time, so I couldn't attend the sessions live. And now I'm in Oregon, so not exactly in the same time zone, but close enough that it's more convenient.
Well, that's wonderful. And I hope that we get to see more of you then.
Thank you.
Let's look at your question that you asked here. And okay. You say, I have been practicing meditation on and off for about 5 years, and I estimate that I'm currently at stage 6, perhaps stage 7. Truthfully, I'm not sure. Simply, subtle dullness no longer seems to plague me, and my concentration on the breath is generally quite strong. These days, I would say that my practice is focused on maintaining a wide scope of attention by feeling the breath through my entire body. I also find that I'm able to zoom out pretty easily and simply watch metacognitively how the mind naturally directs attention and awareness as it sees fit. Meanwhile, I still suffer from intermittent bouts of severe depression, and I'd like to ask for your counsel on how to use meditation to deal skillfully with it. My intuition tells me that I need to learn how to simply allow the feeling of depression to reside in awareness without allowing attention to dwell on it. And yet, in practice, I find that when the feeling of depression comes, I can't help but pay attention to it. And the more I try not to pay attention to it, the more it seems that my mind is determined to pay attention to it. It seems as if even when I'm able to establish my attention on the breath, my mind refuses to let go of attention to the depressed mood. The result is that attention is alternating imperceptibly between the feeling of depression and the breath. It's quite frustrating, to say the least. Leaves me wondering if meditation might in fact be exacerbating the depression. Well, thank you, first of all, for being so open and candid about something that is really far more universal than most people. There is a sort of a stigma with being subject to depression, and all these people are also subject to depression, like to hold that stigma and say, well, I'm not like them. But it's really, basically, you can't think of yourself as a separate entity in a world of other entities without feeling depression. It's just how much, how often, all the forms it takes. So thank you for at least being open about that. You become aware of depression. And what happens when you direct your attention to it? I mean, can you actually focus your attention on that sort of subtle global feeling that is depression?
Yes, very easily.
You can, okay. And what do you find when you do that?
It really depends. I think it really depends. You're talking about in the context of meditation or in my daily life?
In either. I think it would take more of the form in daily life. There would be somewhat different flavor to the experience than in meditation, but I'm talking about both.
Yeah, I've tried. It feels like I've tried using every different, I want to say, mental posture possible to relate to the depression, to use the paradigm that you've expounded upon in your book. I've used attention, just bringing, sorry, did you want to interrupt?
Yeah, I'd like you to stop right there, unless, you're trying to relate to the depression.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, attention is going to try to do what it always does. It gets turned towards something that is a global kind of feeling tone. And of course, it's a feeling tone that has other dimensions to it, but a significant dimension is that there's a certain unpleasantness to that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a global state. How do you focus on a global state? You can't. But attention, that's the only thing attention can do. So when you direct attention towards a global state, immediately attention wants to start picking it apart, deconstructing it, analyzing it, and then it takes the pieces and it starts putting together and making stories and things like that. Isn't that really how depression works? Is that you have these feelings, and because of these feelings, these thoughts come right up, and then these thoughts begin to elaborate, and then they produce more feelings, and there's this synergistic feedback. So the more you think about the feelings, the stronger the feelings are. These other ideas come up, these stories, these, yeah. Best thing you can do is not try to focus your attention on depression. Just let that feeling state be there. What do you focus your attention on? Well, if you think about the thoughts that are at the core of how depression sustains itself and how it goes through its waves of more intense and less intense and everything else. Would you agree that those thoughts are primarily self-referential?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. They're, self-clinging and the desires and aversion that arise out of self-clinging are the cause of suffering, and depression is suffering.
Yep.
So do something differently. Don't focus your attention on your depression, because you're going to be focusing your attention on you, and all of this other elaboration, this papancha, is just going to flow out of that, and it's probably just going to make it worse. If depression is essentially self-referential, place your attention on things outside of yourself, people outside of yourself, their needs, their happiness, their suffering, whatever else. And use your awareness to catch yourself when you start slipping into this self-referential mode again, and turn outward to the world. Have there not been times when you've been depressed, but you needed to do something, and in doing that, you got some kind of positive feedback? I need to do this, and now I've done that. Actually, I feel better, and I like the way this looks now that I've taken care of it. And you actually start going the other way.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Well, that's really just another example of what I'm saying. Is you start turning your focus outwardly, and you do something. And as a result of that doing something, you're now getting a different kind of feedback than you were when you were focused internally, right? Take advantage of that. Do things like that. I've been subject to depression, and one of the things I learned a long time ago was, whatever you do, don't do nothing. Don't sit there and ruminate. Whatever you do, don't do nothing. Get up and do something. Doesn't matter how stupid it is or how useless it may seem. Do something. And the other thing is, this is all arising out of a self-referential process that at its core is just an expression of what the Buddha was talking about in the Four.
Yep.
Recognizing that to the best of your ability, turn outward, move into this place of no separate self, interconnectedness with everything else. I don't have to make me happy. If I make you happy, I'm already happy. Right? So do you think some of these ideas would be helpful with that?
Yes. And I would say that I already intuitively do a lot of those things, but then there's something that happens that, so I I leave the depression, or the depression leaves me, however you want to put it. And then something happens that pulls me back into it after, could be 5 minutes or 5 weeks or 5 months or something like that. And then I'm kind of right back where I started. And so I guess the essence of my question was if there is a role for meditation, or specifically using attention and awareness in specific ways to deal with this, or if your advice is just much more practical, just go do something else and wait for it to resolve naturally.
No, with a more sophisticated understanding and the ability to use your mind, you can do something that's more typically a part of meditation processes, whether you do it in meditation or outside of meditation. You see, it is this, examine this in terms of how your mind system is reacting. Something happens and it tends to bring the depression back. There was some part of you that didn't want that depression ever to come back at all, even in the slightest form. As soon as it starts to emerge, it goes into this resistance mode. This resistance mode can only create more suffering, and more suffering can only enhance the depression. Right? So learning as you've learned in meditation to do in many other ways, learning to accept, learning to expect. Yeah, just like dullness came back, just like distraction came back. Of course, the depressed feelings are going to come back. But I don't need to let that trigger a new cycle of self-reinforcing perpetuation. I don't need to spiral back down into it. And even if I do spiral back down into it, maybe I'll have better luck next time. Sure, I got lost in mind wandering, but maybe next time I'll come out of it a lot more quickly, right? All of these same things that you've learned in meditation, they're going to apply totally to this. I mean, because the phenomenon of depression is really an expression of the human condition. We have these minds that are going to take something, and in this emotional, intellectual dynamic of back and forth and telling stories and all, they're going to take us into play. That's what the human condition is all about. All the suffering that we make for ourselves, all the suffering that we make for other people, as a real result of this same process. There is nothing you do in any stage of meditation that isn't already addressing this at a core, that you accept what is. You don't resist it. You don't create that second arrow of resistance. And you do what you can. And you do what you can. And the thing is that where the intention is appropriately directed, if you keep doing that, you're eventually going to get much, much better at this whole thing. Your ability to deal with depression will improve. But don't, to the degree that you do this with the expectation that your depression is going to be relieved, it's going to be less effective, right? So to the degree, and you have to learn this gradually, bit by bit, but to the degree that you can just, when that comes up, let go of it, then it's going to work better. And that expectation is a form of resistance. And it's really the resistance that becomes this self-magnifying and self-perpetuating thing. It's the same thing that, it takes you into depression. Somebody else, it can take them into a state of anger. There's no somebody else to fear, panic attacks. Isn't a panic attack really another example of this? Oh my God, I think I might feel a panic attack coming on. And sure enough, the very thought that there might be will guarantee that there's a panic attack. All of these things are like that. Eventually, we can come to understand and appreciate that, accept it. Okay, that's the way it is, but I don't have to be at the mercy of this anymore. Can you imagine feeling depressed, but not minding? Okay, I've been depressed before, so I'm depressed now. I'm just going to let it be until it goes away. It always does go away. I mean, don't try to do that tomorrow, but can you imagine getting to that place?
Right. Yes, absolutely. And I've been exposed to, I mean, I very much appreciate your guidance. I've been exposed to all of those ideas. They intuitively resonate with me. I've observed mindfully the entire process that you've just discussed. You know, you can link it to dependent origination, or just say, see as one thing leads to the next, and eventually I'm depressed. And still, there's a part of me that's identified with this entire process, and that can't disidentify from it. And there's an effort. I'm watching that too. I'm watching the effort to disidentify, and that's just reinforcing this sense of separate self, that there is a me that can disidentify. So it's like, to use a crude term, it's like a total mind fuck, because I can see exactly what needs to happen at this point, but yet all of the effort that I'm making to try to accelerate that process is paradoxically reinforcing it.
Yes. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully the day will come, not too long from now, where this isn't an understanding that you can access when something triggers it, but this is the way you immediately perceive these things when they actually occur.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
You're most welcome. Well, I've been through all the questions, and I'm quite happy if anybody else wants to make a comment or has something further they would like me to address. So please, if you do, go right ahead. Otherwise, I'll say adios and see you in 2 weeks. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me this morning, and I look forward to the next time we get together.
Thank you, Culadasa.
Thank you, Ricardo. As well. I'm at all of you. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Yeah, you too.